Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Azure Connections. This is episode 2. I'm Michael Palermo. I'm an evangelist with the Developer Relations team, and today I am joined with
Richard Süßelbeck. I'm also a developer evangelist with the HERE Developer Relations team.
So we're so excited to be back and chatting with you today about another topic which is Azure related. But as always, we'd like to mention a few things. We are live, so that means we encourage you to please go into our Twitch chat, ask questions throughout the entire episode. We want this to be as interactive as possible. If you have feedback or questions, Richard, whose Twitch handle is Susalsaurus. So he is going to be monitoring that throughout our episode today, as well as Peter is always lurking in the background. He is here dev, and he might be posting also helpful links throughout the episode. So with that stated, I want to just do a little call out for our Azure episode 1, Richard, and that is that it's already accumulated over 80,000 views. When we do these live recordings, we then post it to our channel on YouTube, and it's already had an astounding number of views. So welcome back, everybody who watched episode 1. If you haven't seen it, you should. You know, it was an excellent episode showing how to use map images and map tiles for Azure. But today we're going to be doing something different, something that I think is highly important. And that is we're going to talk about Geocode in the context of Azure. But Richard, I specifically have a question for you. I have thought about this a lot, and that is, we both know in this industry that when it comes to maps and location services, geocoding is an essential component. It is so core, and yet from the interactions I know the both of us have had at industry events and things like that, there are some developers that really don't understand what geocoding is. Maybe they've never had to use this service before, or maybe they needed it, they just didn't know it was called geocoding. So my question for you to help everyone else set the stage for today is, how would you, in the simplest terms for someone who's brand new, how would you explain what geocoding is?
Okay, I can give that a try. So I think it's actually fairly simple. What a geocoder does is it converts geographic addresses from one format into another, right? If you want to know where you are, you need to have a geographic address. And we use one form of geographic address every day in our lives. It's just street addresses, right? So if you're at 200 Central Park West in New York, that's an address, right? Something, your house has an address, your office has an address. You use that every day. You write that on letters, packages, and so on. However, that's very useful for humans. However, when you're starting to use technology, let's say you want to use the routing API to get to 200 Central Park West in New York, which, by the way, is the American Museum of Natural History. They have awesome dinosaurs there. If you want to use a routing API to get there, then that routing API doesn't really expect you to give it a street address. What it wants is a latitude and longitude, which is another way of addressing a geographic space on the planet. It's basically two numbers. Won't get into how these numbers are formed, but very often also when you ask a positioning system for a location, it will actually give you a latitude and longitude. And then if you want to display that location to a user, you don't really want to give them a latitude and longitude because that's not a very human readable format. What you want to do is you want to give them a street address. And so essentially a geocoder is just an API that gives you a latitude and longitude for an address, or the other way around, it gives you an address for a latitude and longitude. So you can convert back and forth between those two types of addresses. And we at HERE, we have a huge up-to-date database of all addresses in the world. And so we have a geocoder API that allows you to use that, access that data. That's what a geocoder is and what a geocoder does. And you can imagine how extremely useful that is. Imagine your job is to deliver packages you probably need to run every single one of those packages that comes into your office through a geocoder. So we have enormous usage on our geocoder every day.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that, by the way. I feel like here's another maybe common example of when it might need to be done, just to complement what you've already said, Richard, is that let's say you have a list of 15 cities and you need to digitally place a marker on the map for each one of those cities. As you said, city names are human speak, but where do they actually reside on a digital map? That would be your latitude and longitude. So if you have the list of city names, but you actually need to put the markers are going to be placed by latitude, longitude. So you would use a geocode service. So essentially, just another complementary story to what Richard is saying. Today's episode is going to focus on how to use the geocoding service that we have in multiple styles, or I should say actually in multiple methods of how to call our geocoder, but ultimately it's gonna build up to how to do this with an Azure serverless function. So let's go ahead, Peter, let's zoom into code, and we're gonna dive in and start looking at our very first example of our geocoder, and that is using a geocoder in the context of our SDK. So on our screen, on our code screen right now, what we're seeing here, Richard, is an HTML document that on lines 12 and 13, which I'll just highlight these real quick. On these two lines, these are setting a reference to our core JavaScript SDK. And as you know, typically, this is for what would you say most web developers are accessing our SDK for?
Interactive maps, probably.
Exactly.
Displaying maps. Right.
In this case, that's not what we're doing. I mean, we could, but all we're doing is saying, hey, with our core SDK scripts referenced, and because I initialized our platform with an API key, which you get at developer.here.com, sign up for a free account. Once you have that API key, which, by the way, you don't normally share this with everyone, but this is something that we're just calling out that you would need to provide this as you're making the call to your geocode service. Because we initialized our platform, now from that platform object, we are asking for the geocoding service, which I have created a local object there to reference that. And from it, I'm calling our geocode service saying, hey, I would like to pass in a parameter called search text, and whatever the user types in as a value, we're going to find what the human speak term is. So I might type in something like Phoenix or Berlin, and let's now return, as you mentioned, Richard, a latitude and longitude, right? So that's the core of what this demo is right here. Let's go ahead and see it in action. I'm going to pop up that screen.
And that, by the way, generally is called forward geocoding. And if you want to convert the other way around, that's called reverse geocoding.
Thank you, Richard. So am I right to conclude that if I'm typing in something like a human speak thing like Phoenix, and that's being passed in as my input parameter, this is forward geocoding. When I'm saying, here's the human term, give me the geographical. Great. So I'm gonna expand this response that we got back. This demo, of course, is highly developer centric because all we're doing is going to the console log and just dumping our JSON object that we got, in response, so that we could discuss it. And we have one result in our array. And when I look down in here, I could see things such as our address. And notice by address, what we're referring to is I didn't put a specific address in our text. I could have. In fact, we'll demo that in a moment. But just even putting a city name or even a country name, it's still going to return an address of some kind. It'll give us as much data as it can about that particular area that it found. And so I'd like to personally call out the label here. I think this is really nice when you just need a very concise way to describe what it is that you got in response. But of course, the reason why we called this was because we need to have the latitude and longitude. So Richard, you'll notice on the screen right now that I have expanded something called display position, which gives me a latitude and a longitude. I've also expanded navigation position, which also gives me the same latitude and longitude. Since you're quite the experienced and astute geocoding developer, I would like to ask you, why is there two different ways to get the same latitude and longitude?
Well, it isn't always the same latitude and longitude. Kind of the name sort of gives it away already. You can imagine that you might call this geocoder for different purposes. You gave this example of, I want to put markers on a map for cities. Now, imagine that you want to do this for buildings or sort of a large corporate campus. Then what you want to do for a marker really is put the marker in the middle of that corporate campus. However, if, let's say, your use case is something like navigation, where you want to deliver packages to 10 different companies during the day, then what you actually want is a position you can drive to, kind of near the front entrance of that corporate campus. And so in this case, since you just called up a city, the city center, the display position is the same from the navigation position. But depending on what address you could get back, those might differ, and you can pull out the latitude and longitude that is useful for your use case. Something I still want to call out here on the screen a little further down is the match level. If you go a little further, in this case, we see it as city. And that makes sense, right? Because you put in Phoenix, which is a city name, and the match level actually tells you sort of how precise the result is. If you had put in an address with a house number and every kind of detail, then it would actually have said, oh, this is a house number match level, so it is precise right down to the individual house. Or if you just put in a street name without a number, then it would have given you a street match level, and then you know that the position you get is actually in the middle of a street, and you can figure out how precise the results are and use them appropriately.
Cool. That's very good. And I know that we've chatted about this in the past. What do you find intriguing about even just the address, all the data under address?
Well, the nice thing about it is that it's kind of very well structured. So there is this little label. So if you want to have it easy and you just need a little text string to display somewhere, you can just grab the label and ignore the rest. Right. But very often, of course, you want to format that information in the way that makes sense for your app. Maybe it's not relevant in which state it is. Maybe it's from context, it's completely clear that you're in the United States and you don't need that information. You really just need the street name and the house name, maybe the city, and you want to format it in certain ways. So you get this information very nicely structured, and you can pull out only the information that you want to. You can format things the way you like. You know, in the US where you are, you tend to put house numbers in front of the street name. In Germany, here where I am, we do it the other way around. The label will kind of do that for you in a way that makes sense for that location, but very often you want to have your own way to format that. And since you have all of that data nicely structured and formatted, you can easily do that.
Cool. Well, I'll tell you what, I think it'd be kind of good, again, just to showcase the geocoding service, if we provide some of that as far as an example. Maybe I'll start off with our address for our office in Seattle. So I'm going to copy that, go back over here to our screen, and instead of just putting Phoenix in here, I am going to search for this. I'm going to clear the results that we had and do a search. And now expand this out so that what we're looking at is if we put something much more precise, as you were referring to, in terms of location. So that's interesting that now that match level is house number, right? So it got really specific. And when I look at the address, like you said, in the United States, it looks like we do put our number first, then the street name, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So just the way that you described it.
And you can see that the label sort of formatted it for you in a way that makes sense for most people. So it's a nice little default way to pull it out. But if you want to do it differently, if you want to add additional information, for example, the label does not have the district in it, because that's not usually part of a street address, but that's also information you can pull out and use. The county isn't in there, but all of that information is available for you.
Excellent. Let's just see one more example of that. I'll go back over here and copy. This is our address in Berlin. So I'll go back over to our screen and again, clear the results, and let's see what this looks like for that search. And one of the things I just wanted to call out was what you mentioned before, and that's how the label that gets returned is automatically going to be according to how it's done in that area. So I think that's fantastic. So and again, house number is still...
in this case, you see the house number after the street name, Invalidenstraße 116, whereas the US way of doing it would be to say 116 Invalidenstraße. And the label takes into account the local customs of where that address is, which is the most natural way to display it. But again, up to you how you do that.
I think that's great. And the German accent that you have was highly effective for this episode. I appreciate that. That's very good. Okay, we're going to move over now. So if you're wondering, what's this have to do with Azure? It has nothing to do with Azure. What this is just a core way to access our Geocode service. And we're showing you option one. From an SDK, it's binding you to an HTML client. I mean, that's basically the restrictive use case. It's rich in behavior, but it's going to be restricted to that use case scenario. I'd like to now focus on our REST geocode. So what if you want to make a call using our REST API? And so in this example, just to make it really simple, I hard-coded Phoenix in here. And all I'm doing is I'm making a call to the geocode, based on whatever it is that we're passing in. And let's just go ahead and see what the results are like. However, I want to call out one thing that's kind of interesting. In our JS geocode, we had an API key. In our REST geocode, we have an app ID and an app code. And that's because we have one API key for our JavaScript SDK, but we do have an app ID and app code for our RESTful API call. So that's one of the differences. And I am passing the app ID and the app code along with the URL when I'm making the call.
Yeah, so, and you can get both of those on our developer portal. They're both part of freemium. It's just an additional click in your account.
Exactly. Absolutely. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to go over here now to our REST geocode, and I had already run this and expanded out. You could see Phoenix is there. Now I'm going to ask you, Richard, are you up for the challenge to potentially make a change to this screen and show us another flavor of using the geocode service?
Sure.
So the reason why I'm asking Richard that is because we are in Visual Studio Code and we're in a collaborative session. So as he's typing now, it's actually him typing, not me typing. So, and I don't know if he actually answered yes to that. Did you?
I did, yes. So
okay, so what are you doing?
I'm just adding another parameter here. So one of the things you can do is provide additional location context to your query. So it's one thing to say I'm looking for Phoenix, just generally anywhere in the world. And the result we got, Phoenix, Arizona, is probably the most obvious and correct response to I'm looking for Phoenix. But you might be looking for Phoenix in a different context. So for example, there's a parameter bounding box you can use, and then you can define a bounding box, and then it would prefer results that are within that bounding box over other results that might otherwise be more obvious. A similar thing you can do is the prox parameter, which basically stands for proximity, and you can give it a latitude and longitude. So basically saying, please search in this area, and then you can give it a radius in meters. And so you can, for example, say, search in the proximity of this latitude and longitude, which, by the way, is the latitude and longitude of the office in Berlin, in Berlinstraße 116.
Oh, nice.
And then I did that again because you enjoyed the German earlier on. You're
I
welcome. And then you basically say in meters, please, here's a radius of kind of 5 kilometers. And then it would still give you in the list of results it returns, it would still eventually give you Phoenix, but it would prefer other results that are within that new location context first. And I think I've typed that correctly, so maybe you can just run that again, see if we get a different result.
Let's try it. So again, we're still going to be searching for Phoenix, but now with this new context. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, let's run it. I'll check our response here, and our view survey says.
All right, so here we get an address, and this is actually the Phoenixstraße by Berlin, which is German for Phoenix Street. So you can see the nice umlaut there, which is another nice way to prove that it's German with the funny dots over the O. And essentially what happened here is it was looking for things in or near Berlin that have kind of Phoenix in the name. And you see there too, it's not spelled exactly the same way, but it's close enough. Like the Ö is sort of, you can substitute with that with an O and a E anyway. So it does a little fuzzy searching as well. Which can be very useful. And so you see, just by adding that new context, that new location context, we're getting completely different results. Yep. Or to be more precise, we're getting the same results, but ordered in a completely different way with a new priority.
Yes. Excellent example of that, by the way. So our search term Phoenix never changed, but our context did, and now we're on the other side of the world, or you would say, now we're on your side of the world.
Exactly.
So either way. Okay, so again, what does this have to do with Azure? So far, absolutely nothing, because we just called our RESTful API, and what we've done is we've at least showcased how the geocoding service works, right? But we are about to get into how this is now relevant in the Azure world, but we wanted to build up the geocoding service first, make sure we understand how it's used, and then to see how easy it is to transition all of this into the Azure world. So, any comments before I go there?
While you do that, I would just quickly encourage people in chat, feel free to ask questions. I'm monitoring the chat, and I can throw any of your annoying questions at Michael at any given time. Just let me have them.
Yes. Okay, so what do we need to do to put this into an Azure perspective? I'd like to first of all talk about if you are logged in as a developer at the Azure portal and go to the Azure Marketplace, what you would do is you would search for, you could see I like searching for here, but I'm going to go ahead and just say the one specifically I'm interested in, despite the fact that you might see geocoding appear up here under self-hosted, that's something different than what we're talking about today. I'm just looking for here maps and location services. And when I click on that, it's going to take me to the landing page that will allow me to say, get it now. But this is for our core APIs wrapped in as Azure functions and done for you. So you don't need to do anything other than just basically deploy this and away you go. Now, we did a full deploy of this in episode 1, and I'm going to continue to use the same deployed instance from episode 1. So if you'd like to see what it looks like to follow through that process, go watch that little excerpt from episode 1. But I'm going to take us to the end result, which is the actual core APIs that are available when you deploy that. And of course, today's star attraction is our geocoder function, which is right here. Now, when you click on the geocoder function, what it's going to do is give you access to the code or essentially how this was written. And of course, you can modify this at will. When we scroll down into here, of course, part of the process is that you will have already provided your app code and app ID. They're going to be in your environment variables, so they're going to be secured and not in plain text as we've been seeing so far in our other examples. I think it's kind of interesting that inside of here, Richard, on lines 42 and 43, you'll notice that there's two URLs that this supports from configure. Our forward geocoder, like you were mentioning, we've been doing, and then it also has a reverse geocoder. And the way it knows which one to use is literally down here. It looks for the existence of reverse geocode in the URL that's coming in from the caller, which you'll see in a moment. If it sees that, hey, we're going to use the reverse geocoder URL. Otherwise, we're going to use the forward one. So that's important for something that we'll be showcasing shortly, right? Just to understand how one could be used versus the other. Now that we see that this is the code, the other thing that's important, anytime you're going to access or use any of these functions, there's two major things that you're going to need to make the call. One is already on the screen, and that's kind of this moniker or this identifier for the function. So that's one. It's kind of like the application ID. And then there's this get function URL, which also allows you to copy this entire thing. But at the very end of this line, you'll see at the beginning is that little thing that I highlighted up here. But at the end of this line, which I think it's hard to show on this screen, is what's called the code that's also required to make this call. So I already have that set up. I'm just going to go straight over into the code view right now and show you what that looks like. So here's that identifier that we just looked at, but then here's the code that appeared at the end of that line. And all we need to do when we're constructing our call, I'm doing a fetch down here, and I'm calling Azure website. So this is that whole function call, but where I'm putting in something different is whatever's being typed into place by the user, and then this call, this Azure function key. So do you remember how we got the Azure function key, Richard?
Yes, there was a little nice copy opportunity in the
absolutely
Azure dashboard.
Just want to make sure we make that clear connection. That's how this whole URL actually comes into play. But of course, we're modifying it so we can put in our own variables. Do you see the existence, Richard, anywhere in this URL of something called reverse geocode?
I do not.
I don't either. So what will it use then for our geocode service?
The forward geocoder.
Exactly. So just making that crystal clear, we're now going to go back into the call that we made earlier, or into the browser, excuse me. And I'm going to showcase that one. Now I'll put in again something as simple as Phoenix and get geolocation. So I have a couple things. I already have the latitude and longitude just specifically, plus I can look at the entire view if I wanted to. But basically, this is a working version of the geocoder now using the Azure function as the call. So I'm going to do something, Richard, a little crazy. Are you ready for this?
I don't know if I'm ready for it, but
I know.
It's live, so I have no other choice.
I know. Here's what I'm going to try live. I'm going to go back over to this that you added before and just prove a point. I'm going to take this, copy it, and I'm going to add that into this as well, like right here. Add a little ampersand.
You added an extra accent there that you need to remove before the ampersand. Just hit backspace. Does that make sense?
Oh, thank you.
Looks better.
I'll make sure. I'll scroll across. Looks like it's right. Looks like everything is good. So with that call there, we know going now back over to this screen, we saw that originally 33112, this was like our response for Phoenix. I'm going to refresh this page and put Phoenix in here again. And if all goes well, when I call it, I should not see anything other than something that is clearly no longer on this side of the planet because I don't see a negative latitude anymore, right?
And I can tell you from experience that is something in or near Berlin at the very least. So this should be our Phoenixstraße again.
Exactly. So the whole point of doing this little demo was just to make sure that you understand that when you're modifying or wanting to use our Geocode service, all the parameters are supported. When I go back over into the code view, all you have to do is just make that part of that URL call. So even though the beginning part is the Azure piece, it's really the same kind of call. So our documentation is fully all you really need to know on how to make all these different calls. Does that make sense?
It kind of does. Like once you've got it set up on Azure as an Azure function, you can essentially use it just like you would have used it with the REST API before. Once you've got this set up, like you said, you just go into our documentation, look up which parameters you need, figure out how it works, and just use them there as you normally would.
Absolutely. So we're about halfway through the episode, and I just want to do a double check before we go on to the next exciting component. Is there any questions or any comments that we need to address from Twitch Chatland?
My Surface has turned itself conveniently off, but I'm back on. There's lots of robot faces from Laura. Somebody said "woo-ah," which I appreciate the enthusiasm. So does our Geocoder API. So far, I don't think there are any specific questions.
Okay.
Maybe you've just been really, really clear.
Or you have as well. And when you said woo-ha with a German accent, I think that's going to make the episode right there. Personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a question right there from Roberto. If you have a list of addresses, we have some rate limits, requests per second. So if you have a large number of addresses, then I would suggest you actually don't use the standard geocoder. We have a specific API for that that's called the batch geocoder. And you can essentially take the list of addresses just as for example, as comma separated values, upload them to the batch geocoder, and then start a job. It'll process them in the background and let you know when it's finished, and you can check on the status there as well. There's no specific limits on this. Again, the 250,000 API calls applies as well, though obviously you don't upload 250,000 addresses called the batch geocoder once. It counts as one. Every geocoding call inside that batch geocoder call. So you could upload a batch of 250,000 addresses and would still be within the limits of our freemium plan. Yeah. So if you have a large number of addresses like this, then the batch geocoder is probably what you want to use.
Right. And I just want to call out that batch geocoding API is not currently part of the Azure function core APIs that are delivered. So that would be a direct call. Yeah. So I just want to highlight that. But excellent. I'm glad that you mentioned the batch geocoder. That's great. All right. So if there's no other specific questions, I'm going to dive into the next area that I think is really fun to talk about.
Okay.
So, Richard, I'm going to take you down a walk down memory lane. And this is going back to episode 1 of our Azure Connections when we talked about map images and map tiles.
And unicorns, right?
Well, I don't remember if unicorns were in that particular episode, but if you want to believe that, that's okay for me.
I'm just going to pretend there were unicorns in that one too.
It's a different show, but it's okay. Okay. However, I do want to call out that this code that's on the screen, for the most part, is the same code that we had in episode 1 when we showcased how you could use our map tile API in harmony with Leaflet, the rendering engine for a variety of different map tiles, which also supports here map tiles. And so this is already wired up to use Leaflet, our map tiles, and here's the thing, we had fun, going in here and changing the scheme, from normal day to all sorts of different things. But, it really produces a nice map layout. But here was the challenge that I felt like I had. In our JavaScript SDK, if we use an interactive map, it's very easy to interact as a developer with that map with our JavaScript SDK. But I was wondering, how hard would it be if I wanted to support some kind of behavior, such as what if I want to click somewhere on a map using Leaflet, and I want to extract the latitude and longitude of that location and then provide some data regarding that location. I mean, that seems reasonable, right? So in our JavaScript SDK, that would be a piece of cake. That'd be easy. So I was wondering, is it going to be complex to do in Leaflet? Well, the answer is it really wasn't complex, but it does require, of course, that because we don't have the benefit of having the Geocoder service already bound with our SDK, we'll have to create another call to our Geocode service. So you'll notice on line 21, we have kind of our base map tile URL that's being constructed, but on line 22, we now have a new URL going to our Azure function. And did you notice anything interesting about any of the verbiage in this one?
Well, that one says reverse geocode.
Yes. And so the reason why it's important to highlight this is you'll notice the beginning of our URLs are always going to be like the Azure function ID, and then it says Azure websites. But if you were to go to our documentation and look at the actual RESTful API call, the beginning of that URL will actually say reverse geocode, and that's one of the distinctions there. So in order for us to make that proper call, even though it's also using this reverse geocode.json in the API, the RESTful API call as well, we need to make sure when the actual underlying call happens that it's going to have that proper moniker at the very beginning. So that's why it does that check, so it can swap between one URL versus the other. So now let me show you. First of all, just for a heads up, I will move over to the screen and at least show you. This is what this is what the map looks like. I can so this is just the standard thing that we already created in episode 1, map tiles with Leaflet, right? So going back over to the code view, I want to now display what changed, significantly. The first thing is that with the map object, this is something that I created from Leaflet. So this isn't our stuff. This is Leaflet. The map object, I'm saying, if it gets clicked on, let's go ahead. I created an anonymous function and say, well, let's log the results. Let prox equal basically the concatenation of the latitude and the longitude with a comma in between of wherever it was that we clicked on the map. And then let's go invoke our Geocoder API. So I pass in the event arguments as well as this new prox thing that I just created. Down here, the function that's handling that, I fetch using our Geocoder, from that base geocoding URL that we looked up at before. And I'm passing in proximity because that is an actual argument that you can use for our reverse geocoder. It's saying, hey, you're not giving me a name like Phoenix. You're actually giving me a proximity, which is including the latitude and the longitude. Then with the response, notice what I'm grabbing here. Something
we talked about the label earlier, and I said, This is great if you want to be lazy and you just want to very quickly grab the human readable address of a place without having to format things yourself. The label is great.
I may have said efficient over lazy, but that's okay. So now that we have that understanding, I'm going to go back over to our map and let's see it in action. So I'm just going to randomly click somewhere. And what happens is it's providing at that location as much information as it can, the latitude and the longitude, but it's also letting me know the zip code. It's Arizona. It's in the United States. If I go down here, now it's giving me information more. Now we're in Mexico. Now I had to do a little bit of error stuff because if I go over into the ocean, and click here, you know, all I'm going to get is a latitude and longitude. Let me explain why that's the case. Let me see if you might figure this out. If you don't, that's okay, because you didn't know I was going to ask you this. But why did I have to check to see if the length of our view was greater than 0 on line 49?
Well, I'm guessing you might simply not get a response in the ocean because there's no human readable address there, right?
This
so
is
you can't get an address label for somewhere in the ocean because the ocean does not. The ocean has latitudes and longitudes, but it does not have street addresses or zip codes or that kind of stuff.
You are so correct, sir. Because when I was doing this demo originally, I was trying to click on. Let's see if I can even find it here.
Let's see if a man who works for a map company can find Hawaii on a map.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
So I think what I did is I accidentally overstepped, and then I started to get errors. And the reason was because, hey, you don't have anything there. So I had to like zoom in and go, oh, you mean, oh, okay, then that's the way. But that error handling there is just basically say, okay, I didn't get a view. So let me at least get the latitude and longitude. I got that much, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about this, and of course, I'm not even prepared to answer this. So if a question comes in, I'll have to say you'll have to tune in later, because if you click somewhere, you might get a response that you don't even know how to read. Potentially.
I believe this reads something like Zhongguo, which is China.
I'll just have to take your word on it.
Yeah, you probably should.
And then other areas, again, you know, I was clicking on where, again, the text that might come back might not necessarily be something that we can read, but it is according to the geography of the area that we're clicking on, right? So just letting you know that the one thing I don't know how to address yet is if there's a way to force that response to come back in a specific language. I think there is, but I don't know how. So in other words, if I wanted all responses in English.
I'm fairly certain you can do that, though off the top of my head, I would also not know what the parameter is called.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to switch back over to the code view and just have a brief chat there. Again, we're using retrieve areas as our mode. And I put the max results as 1. The reason why I'm bringing this up, Richard, what would be an example of when I may, for instance, not want the results to be just 1?
Sorry, I got distracted because I really wanted to know what that parameter was. So I think the parameter is language, which is obviously a good answer, just not to the question you were asking me.
I love that you answered the question I didn't ask, but I did ask in a past tense. So great. And I'll just go ahead and answer this one. There are times when you are doing a request in a particular area. Kind of think of like the reverse of what we did before when Richard was saying, hey, let's look for Phoenix, but let's restrict it to an area. We also might want the opposite. We might want to say, I want to give you a specific area, but expand it out to give me multiple responses as to what is at that area. So that's why we have the max results set to 1. Now, when I said my mode is retrieve areas, I also have another option to retrieve addresses. So it could be not just that I want to retrieve what's the area name, you know, the general area, but I might want to have specific addresses based on a particular point on the map. So I just wanted to call that out, and don't know if you have any other comments that you want to add to that, but that's pretty
I don't have a comment, but there is a question in chat, which I'm going to throw at you. And it's from Ashdav 2005. Is it possible to add custom business logic to the here functions and make them available to other devs in my application team?
I love that question. This is actually the core reason why you probably would want to do exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. This code that you see here is now your code. In other words, this is a deployed version of our API call now hosted in your environment. So if you make changes here, you're not messing with the original. This is yours now. So absolutely, this is a common use case for serverless functionality, is you're going to add your own business logic in here. You may have validators or various type of caching mechanisms or whatever it is that you want to implement inside of your own functions. And as you said, make available for your team. So the question actually calls to the whole point as to why this is such a cool thing to do, is it gives you a way to have a business purpose API for location services. And the other advantage too is, of course, that API can be useful across the board to things such as web clients, mobile apps, or other type of services that need this. So excellent question.
Thank you so much. All right, let's go back to where you were.
Sure.
And we were retrieving areas.
Yeah, so I just wanted to call out that when you're invoking our reverse geocoder, it could make sense. In my situation, if I do one click on a map, I only want one response. In this example, just a simple pop-up. But I might actually want to retrieve a list of things and maybe set markers around that are based on the kind of data that I would get back. So if I were to use retrieve addresses instead, or another one of the modes, that would just change, again, the context of the kind of search that I'm doing. So I just want to make sure that everyone was aware of that. All right. Any other comments or questions?
I don't have any smart comments, and I'll keep the dumb ones to myself. And so far, I don't see any other questions, but when one pops up, I'll let you know.
Okay. So just while we're still in this context, I want to call out that the ability to use our geocoder service within Azure is made possible when you go to the Azure Marketplace, search for here, and find the here map and location services. This is that bundle of all those functions. Whether you use them all or not is up to you, but they're available to you. And as one of the questions was already asked, modify at will. You know, make it your purposeful function for your business. With that stated, I'd say let's return to our studio. But it's a nice transition here to the chat with our.
You can't see our director Peter, who's working in the background, but I have a video of him, and he just had like a little moment of panic, and then he was pushing buttons, which I enjoyed tremendously.
Yes. I also enjoyed tremendously, Richard, that you have once again joined us on an episode where on your side of the planet it is late at night.
Way too late at night.
Yeah, so thank you for staying up and doing this episode with us. I want to call out some things. For example, our episode that you're watching right now will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you were to, I believe that might be shared in our chat. But please, all our past episodes are there. So take a look. That should be available sometime, I believe, early next week. Mm-hmm. Also, if you have any other questions about this episode, keep them flying in our chat. We still have time to answer those. We would like to encourage all, if you haven't done so already, if you are Twitter savvy and you would like to follow some key aliases, the first one would be HereDev. That is our official developer relations alias for all members of our team. Specifically, you also might want to follow myself, Palermo4, and I think these links are also going to be added into our chat, as well as Richard Susselbeck. His alias is just Susselbeck, so that should also be provided. An inner voice in my head said, yes, that it's all going to be there. The date of our next episode. I'm actually hopeful, Richard. And we're doing this live, so I'm putting you on the spot. I don't know on that one or not, but I hope you can make it. If you can't, maybe we'll have somebody else. But if you can, you're welcome to join again. If you like the late night shows, it seems to be fun. You actually don't seem as grumpy at night.
So what you're saying, this is once I get tired, I get nicer, and that's why you're making me do these past 8 p.m.
No, I think. But our next episode is going to be October 30th. So same time, October 30th. I believe, if I have my memory correct, we'll be talking about our Places API.
That's interesting too. That's kind of the next logical step. Well, we've talked about addresses today, but very often I talked about going to 200 Central Park West, but you don't actually go to 200 Central Park West. What you want to go to and search for and display is the American Museum of Natural History. And that's what the Places API will allow you to do.
Absolutely. So that should be a really fun episode. I'm gonna look forward to that. I'm not saying it'll be the best ever, but I am saying it's going to be a fun one. Okay. Another thing I want to call out is our Mapathon with XYZ. Yep. That is still running, and I believe there is going to be a live stream in November on that. Is that correct? It's next week, actually. October 24th. I'm sorry, my note said November, but special episode Explore XYZ on October 24th, and that will be at 10 a.m. Pacific time.
Okay.
And we are also in the process of coming up with content and exciting ideas for season 3 of Developer Waypoints. So be on the look for that. I'm looking forward to that for sure. I love waypoints. Richard, do you have any shameless plugs?
Yes, actually, maybe a couple. So one of the cool things about the Geocoder API is that you can get more information from it about a place than just the address. For example, Michael did the retrieve areas endpoint or parameter earlier. You can actually, for example, from the Geocoder, get the shape of the area if you want to display it on the map. Or you can get information about a place like what's the current time there? What's the time zone offset? Are they driving on the left side or the right side of the road? What's the local currency and so on? This isn't Azure related, but I recently wrote 2 blog posts about how to do this and display that information on the map. Those 2 blog posts should hopefully be shared in the chat as well. Also, I'll be at 2 events pretty soon, 2 DroidCons, DroidCon in London. So if you want to meet in person and you happen to be in London at DroidCon towards the end of October, I would love to meet you there. And then I will also be at DroidCon in Chennai in India. So that would also be an opportunity for you to meet me and other people of the team as well. So I think that's 4 shameless plugs, and I think that's enough for one night.
Okay. And I would only say, just to add to that, if you happen to be in Code Motion in Milan, Italy next week, please look me up. I'll be there as well. All right. Well, please continue to follow our channel. Make sure and turn on those notifications so you're aware of when there's new episodes. And without further ado, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining in for our episode today. Thank you again, Richard, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.